we'll get this going. And okay. So I went to a conference on artificial intelligence and development intersection. And it was a fascinating conference. And I learned a lot about it. And part of, like I was saying earlier, part of going to a conference, you have to do a brown bag to discuss what you learned while you were at that conference. So this is why we're here. For those who don't know me, my name is John Cullen. I'm part of the .NET practice at STG. I am a full stack developer. I've been with STG over 11 and a half years now and continuing. I actually have a business degree, not a computer science degree, which makes me a little bit odd among programmers. And I have been designing and developing systems for over 30 years, coming up on 35 years now. Been around the block a time or two, and I've seen a few things. I'm also an author, voice actor, producer. I write stories that bring technology to life, and you can find down in the right-hand corner, there's a link to my webpage. You can find all of my works. They come in print, Kindle, and audio for no matter how you want to consume your books, we got you covered. Right now, I'm working on my 5th and 6th novels. The 5th one is The AI Whisperer, and it's due to come out in the 3rd quarter of this year. And the conference that I went to was the Microsoft Azure and AI conference co-produced by Microsoft and Dev Intersection. That's quite a mouthful. And there were literally hundreds of breakout sessions to choose from SQL to AI to everything about .NET that you can think of. This conference is held twice every year. Typically, the spring has been held in Orlando, and in the fall, it's in Las Vegas. This year, however, they elected to have both the spring and the fall in Las Vegas. So that might be changing, who knows? The workshops in the fall just occurred. They were April 3rd, 4th. The conference was April 5th through the 7th with workshops on the 3rd, 4th, and 8th. And the next one coming up is in the fall. It's going to be towards the end of November or early December, as soon as they publish when that's going to be. Here are some of the people who were keynote speakers at the conference. You might recognize a few of their names: Dan Holm, Charles Lamanna, Scott Guthrie, big names in Pluralsight on the .NET side. Some of the conference sessions that I attended: architecture restructuring with Joval Louis. He is actually one of my heroes. Years and years ago, I read a book that he authored on how to design our software. And this guy is really funny. He is very adamant that as software developers and architects, we are doing it wrong, plain and simple. And I went to 2 different sessions where he was able to enlighten us on the proper ways of doing analysis and design of systems. We don't have time to get into that, but I thought it was interesting. The Functional Journey of C# by Mads Torgerson. Fascinating session that I went to, where he just went step by step by step how C# became more and more functional, adding the expressions and things like that. It was very fascinating. I learned a lot. There was introduction to deployment and machine learning and ethical dilemma of AI. All of those were fun. I attended a couple of workshops, everything about .NET 6, and now all of a sudden we have .NET 7 in preview. So everything I learned 6 months ago is almost out of date. I also attended a day-long conference on introduction to quantum computing, and most of that went over my head, but I was still fascinated by it. we're going to take a little bit of a detour and talk about OpenAI just a little bit. This is a company that was started by Elon Musk back in 2015, and they created what they call GPT-1, the Generative Pre-trained Transformer, and they published that in 2018. That was, as memory serves, was built on something like 75 million parameters. And it's the introduction of artificial intelligence and speaking English and doing it really well. In 2019, they published GPT-2, and they actually didn't do a full release because they were afraid that people would use its capabilities to create fake news and other misuse of a language generation. And so they held off for another year when they came out with GPT-3. That edition, the latest that we have right now, was built on 175 billion parameters. And in early 2023, they say they're going to come out with GPT-4, and it could have up to 100 million parameters. Now, to put that into perspective, our brains have between 80 and 100 billion neurons. And so we're talking factors beyond that as far as the parameters go. That's important because GPT-2, 3, and 4, we start to approach that point where machines can start writing creative works, which affects me in my other life as an author and voice actor. And one of the things I was trying to pay attention to during the conference was, where is AI going? Where is it going to take us in the next few years? And I firmly believe that in the next 10 years, our jobs as developers and designers are going to radically change. And gone are the days of typing out code one character at a time. We'll get into some examples of how that works. One of the first forays into this idea of machines programming for us came by way of what they call the flash fill Excel feature. And you can read more about that on the link down there at the bottom. The idea behind this is programming by example. Now, let's say that you have this column of numbers, and let's say further that you know these numbers are Social Security numbers. And we, by mandates of PII and HIPAA, we know that we have to mask and obfuscate all personal information. So we need to do something about these Social Security numbers to obfuscate them. What we can do in Excel today is we can come in on the second column there and type in an example of what we want it to look like. Now, in this case, we're going to add dashes, and we're going to take the 2 digits in the middle and turn them into X's and obfuscate the number. Now, we could do it any other pattern, but this is the one that I chose. Now, once I've done that one time and I hit Control E, all of a sudden every row has an example based on the information to the left of how that gets transformed. Now, this is more than just numbers. We can do this with lists of names. Let's say you have a list of names that's last name, comma, first name, space, middle name. And you want it to show first initial, middle initial, last name. We'll give it an example, hit Control E, and it will figure out, based on the information, what it needs to change to make that work. Absolutely fascinating ideas when you stop and think about what's going on behind the scenes. Let's jump into a demo real quick. And Oh, let's get rid of some of this stuff we don't need to look at. Let's take a look at this. In the normal routine of coding, our solutions that we do right now, it, like I said before, the old ways of doing it one character at a time are going to go away. And let's see an example of this. Now, as you know, just by starting to type in commands, you start to get IntelliSense on what possibilities are out there for you to work with. But let's say, for example, I did this. I typed in a CON. Look at what IntelliSense is doing for me now. Not only does it give us the list that we're familiar with of all the options, the possible commands I could be going for, but it gives me what it most likely thinks, based on code before, what it is that I'm really after. Let's say, for example, that I'm not interested in a constant, but I wanted to do some kind of a console. You see how that changed? And note that it took the path from the line above and made that happen. So we can hit tab a couple of times and accept that. And we can continue on down the road with looking at other kinds of changes that we're likely to see. For example, let's do this. Whoops. Now, again, we have our IntelliSense, which we've seen before for years and years now. We've got this thing called a string service. Great. No problem. Let's use it. And then when we hit oh, come on, it's not going to work with me now. Oh, I know what I did wrong. Let's do that line over again. We're not seeing anything really new, except every now and then you'll notice some gray text that is trying to identify what it is based on the code above that it thinks it needs next. Now, I find this kind of fascinating, that I can get somewhere down the road on typing in a command and adding parameters, and based on the code lines above it, it knows or makes a reasonable guess at what you think it might want to have. Fascinating to me. Let's go one more further. Let's do this. Oh yes, okay. If oftentimes the code that we write, we take a variable, we initialize it to some value, and then we check it. Typically, we're going to check to see if it's null, but it doesn't have to necessarily be that. In this case, our variable st is actually a string, so we could do something like string.is null or empty. And now notice that it knows we're going to be checking st based on the artificial intelligence inside of GPT-3, which is driving the IntelliSense here. Let's see here. One other thing that I wanted to show. Why didn't it do that? There we go. Some more IntelliSense. Based on something like 30,000 code solutions that it found in GitHub, when they trained the IntelliSense models, they realized in training that model that there were very consistent patterns that we as developers use. And in this case, it knows that the most likely pattern is if this condition happens to be true, then we probably want to stop processing. Now, the fact that a computer, a program is figuring this out, it blows my mind in many cases. So those are just some examples of how our lives are going to be changing in the next decade or so. One thing that we do on a very regular basis is we do a lot of code refactoring, especially at STG. One of our jobs is to go in and fix other people's poorly written code. And so we end up doing a lot of refactoring. Let's look at a couple of examples. Here we have this refactoring weather class. All it is converting between Fahrenheit and Celsius, some formulas there, but it was done in a poor fashion. If we look at this, we'll realize that we're seeing these same formulas over and over and over again. And as developers, we know that's not the best way to do things. So we can come in here, let's go here, and we're gonna utilize a function that we know is called F to C. We're going to take a Fahrenheit temperature and convert it to Celsius. Now, by going in here and giving it an example of how I want to change a particular line, if we were to come down here and do that one more time, right here, something kind of fascinating happens. You see this little toolbar here? When you look at the examples, it went through and found all of the other examples, in this case, one line, where that same pattern of making a change needs to occur. Now, this is just a very small file. We work on files that are thousands of lines and thousands of files. This is one step in getting us closer to easier refactoring. In fact, it displays it to us, if you look over here, in a pattern that we're already familiar with in looking at differences between files. On one line, we have the red that has been deleted, and on the next line down, the green of how it's going to be added to. And when we click on this, take note of line 55. Watch what happens. Isn't that interesting? That it knew to go and make those changes for us as well. So a real quick demo, and I talk kind of fast, so I guess I didn't prepare very much. What we've seen is IntelliSense based on artificial intelligence. And we've seen refactoring based on review of code and review of what we have previously written in order to assume or make the best guess at what code we need to write next. And it's fairly accurate, actually. And it was done in a way that allows us to make changes. Like you saw with the if statement. If st, well, let's continue that and say string.is null, and it makes that change. It figures out, based on intelligence, what we are trying to accomplish. And it assists us that way. Initially, IntelliCode used GPT-2, the OpenAI natural language processing model, to generate code, synthetic text. Based on the context of previous lines of code, IntelliCode and IntelliSense suggest the algorithm, thereby enabling developers to code quickly. All of this was done to improve development agility through IntelliCode. This feature provides AI-assisted suggestions and whole line code completions. But what if we want to take it further? Where is it going to go in the next few years? If the code models, the prose models, are being based on GPT-3 and thousands of lines of well-written, documented code, it can, one of the places that we're starting with right now is having one line of code completed for us with a simple tab. Beyond that, we're going to start seeing more lines and pages. This is not just something that is accepted from Microsoft and you have no choices other than that, because you can train your own models, your own IntelliSense models based on the way that you and your shop run your code. And it's called team completions. And they become part of the normal developer workflow, and anyone with access to your repository automatically gets the team completions when you get this set up. To do that, take a look at the link down at the bottom of the page. Those are places that give us the instructions on how to get this set up. But if we keep our team completions up to date with the new Azure DevOps tasks, that retrains itself on your CI, that gives us a lot more capabilities. PowerFX is one of the demonstrations I went to when I was at the conference. It is part of the Power suite of applications that Microsoft has. And Power BI and Power Apps, PowerFX, they're all part of the same family. And they are open source language for low code interaction. And it's based in part on that fill-in feature that we saw from Excel. This project, PowerFX, was announced in early 2021. And the thing that is better than the IntelliSense that we have right now is that it's trained on GPT-3, not 2, which transforms natural language. Now, I was unable to, because I'm cheap and I don't want to pay for it, to actually give you a demonstration. But what I saw was fascinating. Let me run you through it real quick. Power users have, in the Power BI world, they have their data sets that they are capable of viewing. They are authorized to view. And in those cases, you can have your sales department looking at sales tables and your customer service department looking at customer tables, and you can separate your infrastructure that way so that things stay compartmentalized and secure, right? But in the Power App world, if a power user has a list of the data sources available to them and they select one, and then they go to this text box and they type in just regular English, show me customers by last name, and it will figure out from that language, that obtuse language, that you want to see a select statement off of a SQL table that is something like select last name, first name from customers. But it goes even further than that. They gave several examples of different ways of attacking that information, including the ability to say, sort it by last name. And it knows, or sort it by last name, first name. And it knows, based on English, how to write that script for you. It will make possible for budding developers to use conversational language to develop programs. And that means that the kids coming out of high school that are quick on our heels are going to be doing things a lot faster than we are because we're stuck in the old days of doing things one character at a time. What if we could take this even a step further? What if we could answer a few questions and have machine learning figure out and write thousands of lines of code for us? Wouldn't that be fascinating? Well, wait, don't we already have that? When we start a new project in Visual Studio, we go in and we answer a few questions, like selecting what basic template project type we're going to create, be it a console app or a MVC web app or a WebAssembly app, right? We answer a few questions, we hit a button, and the templates provide for us a folder and file structure with literally thousands of lines of code already written for us. But what if we took that even a step further? What if we could, like on that PowerFX, select a table from our from inside of Visual Studio and select connect to a database and select one or more tables and have machine learning write a front-end GUI, a RESTful API, and an entity framework or Dapper business service layer, all by a press of a button. What I'm talking about is something along the lines of what I've got demonstrated here as Bethany's Pie Shop. We have an API with a controller, code that we're used to seeing, right? We come down here to the data and we've got interfaces and models and services which go and get the data out of the database. And then further down, we have an app, which gives us our MVC Razor pages for things like an add employee dialogue or employee details or edits or overviews. A couple of years ago, I was on a contract with the Department of Alcohol and Beverage Control for the state of Utah. And there we were transforming old code into updated MVC type patterns like we see here. And it eventually got to the point by the end of the contract, we were actually writing some of the new Razor pages for them to finish this project off. We did that in about 9 months. And in 9 months, I think I wrote close to 1 million lines of code, because I took this very idea of getting to a database, reading the metadata about a table, about the columns and the names and the data types and the nullabilities of it, defaults. And then I wrote another script which used that information and scripted out the models and the interfaces and all of the lines of code that I needed to go in and add to their solution so that I could very quickly add one more table and one more page and one more service very, very quickly. And in doing so, the people who followed after me were impressed, to say the least. And that was just using a couple of scripts. What if we got artificial intelligence involved and it knew how to write literally millions of lines of code for us? How will that change our jobs? It's interesting to think about that. If you want to see IntelliSense and IntelliCode upfront, go into your options. There's a line item there for IntelliCode. You can go in and turn it on. They're turned off by default. And if you go down to the link at the bottom, that gives you more information on how and what to get set up. Then you can start seeing the kinds of code suggestions that I've demonstrated today. Make no mistake about it. Our lives in the last 10 years have changed dramatically. The way that we used to develop code to the way that we do it now, in the next 10 years, it's going to explode. And artificial intelligence is going to do a lot of that work for us. One of the concerns that I have as an author is if artificial intelligence is going to start writing creative works, where does that put me as a writer? Where does that make my life more difficult, and where does it make it easier? Because if I can get a machine to write out half of my story, what normally takes about a year for me to work on part-time on a 100,000 word novel, if I can cut that down to a matter of months, that would make my life a whole lot easier. But it will also change it. It will change how I approach writing a novel. And it will change how I approach writing and wordsmithing the code that I write. Give yourselves a round of applause. You've put up with me for half an hour now. Do you have any questions that I could answer?
Yeah, just in general. So who do you think in this whole AI field right now, who do you think is being the most disruptive to the industry as of late?
Well, there's a lot of people who would like to be malicious about what it is they're doing with AI. And that was one of the reasons why Elon Musk and his group at OpenAI did not release GPT-2, because they were worried that it would be so easy for somebody to go in and create fake news, for example, that it made it too easy. And they were worried about how it was going to be used. And out of those discussions came the ideas of eleemosynary AI. And that's a great big word that says based in charity. Now, if we have AI that is beneficial to humans, and we don't have the Terminator scenario of machines trying to kill us because we're all morons, that would help the AI industry a great deal. And so they being the experts in the AI industry, Elon Musk and the others that he works with, IBM and Google and Microsoft, they all have some really smart people working on this. And their biggest concern is how it's going to get misused. And so they do things like eleemosynary AI, and they try to figure out how to write the foundations of AI so that it doesn't do things. Years ago, we had a experiment that was done where two AI models were basically just going around a board and they were picking up marbles. And they found something kind of interesting through experimenting with running these models side by side. And one of the things that they discovered was when there is a good number of marbles to pick up, the AIs kind of ignored each other. But when the marbles became scarce, their activities changed and they started to dodge and get in front of and block the other AI so that it could have more marbles. And when you stop and think about machines behaving that way, there is a lot of room for me as a horror writer to write about AI that's gone awry. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I can't wait for a utopia and or computer enslavement.
Utopia or dystopia? Which way are we headed?
Good question.
Well, excellent. Preston, thank you very much for that. Anybody else have any questions?
John, there's a question in the chat from Evelyn.
Okay, let me get to chat real quick.
I can read it or you can read it, whichever's better.
Oh, wow, there's a lot of comments here. I wasn't even paying attention. Okay, the last one down at the bottom. What do you think about unstructured genetic algorithm learning, such as NEAT or HyperNEAT? To be honest, I haven't looked into the unstructured genetic algorithms. What I kind of focused on in looking at AI was how, number one, where did I see the trends of things going? Because I want to write about the things that keep me up at night. That's my horror writer part of it. The other part of it was I wanted to understand how machines could help me become a better writer, about how to wordsmith sentences and pick the right verbs and pick the right right adverbs and descriptive language and emotions and colors. And, I thought, well, how is AI going to be able to help me do those kinds of things? And so those are very structured activities. Unstructured is most likely the future. I totally agree. Chaos seems to be the name of the game. And as programmers, we're used to a very finite set of rules. When we do A, B happens, we're pretty solid on that. But with AI, we train a model and we can't really predict what it's going to come out with. All we can do is look at the output of what's coming out, look at that output and evaluate whether or not it's any good. All right, make those human judgments. Yes, exactly. We have to supply the training, and all of the training is millions and millions and millions of rows of data, terabytes and zettabytes of data that is all identified as this category or that category or the next category. And somebody has to go in and make those choices. And we take that that data and we translate that into a machine model. That's what we call the learning process. And in that process, we give it data. Eventually, we're going to reach the point where computers start going out and looking for their own data to train themselves on. And that's a level of chaos that keeps me up at night. Excellent questions. Anything else? All right, you guys. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating.
John, there's one more question in the chat.
Okay. Do you think that AI will replace human creativity in the future? Absolutely. In fact, we've already got examples of AI writing novels, writing poetry, writing songs. Those are already happening. They've been happening for a number of years now. In fact, there was one, people over at MIT put together a Frankenstein-like AI where you give it a line of code and it would tell you the next, or a line of dialogue or a line of story, and it would tell you the next several lines. And I tried it out a couple of times, and this was back 2 summers ago that I was playing around with that. And it was fairly fascinating how close it got to, what was I trying to think? Where was I trying to point it? And did it go in that direction? And several times they took directions that I was not prepared for them to handle. Some of the times it was totally off base, but some of the times the language was close to being human. We all have the, what's the guy's name? I've forgotten his name now. Starts with a T. The test of whether or not a computer can come across as a human being. The Turing test, yes, Turing. See, I knew it started with a T. And the Turing test is that point where machine language is so good that we as a human being cannot tell whether or not we are communicating with a person or with a machine.
Didn't they already crack that?
They, in some cases, now what Terminator and those other kinds of movies and stories that are coming out, what they tend to do is they tend to say we are approaching singularity, which is that point when general artificial intelligence exceeds human beings. We are not there yet. The closest we've come is being able to simulate some kinds of conversations. But
well, I mean, the Turing test wasn't, does it exceed humans? It's if you're talking to an entity, can you tell if it's a machine or not?
Yes,
and I thought they cracked that on like a text-only type of thing.
Right. And when the computer can exceed most people's understanding and make that difficult for them to make a choice of which one it was or to get it wrong, that point is when general artificial intelligence begins to exceed human beings. If those days are approaching, will they happen in my lifetime? Will we see singularity? I'm not sure, to be honest. I know that we have a long way to go to get there. Yes, I get flagged as a machine all the time too. I hear you. Oh, well, it's been a great discussion. Thank you guys very much for attending. I think that wraps everything up.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Thank you all for attending.